The stagecoach hit another deep rut in the road, and the entire wooden carriage jumped like a frightened horse. Inside, the passengers grabbed their seats and cursed under their breath. But none of them were really thinking about the rough road. They were thinking about the baby. The infant had been screaming for nearly 2 hours straight. Not crying. Screaming. The kind of sharp, desperate sound that crawled into a person's skull and refused to leave. One man had already stuffed cotton into his ears. Another had pressed his hat over his face and prayed the stage would reach the next town soon. Yet the baby kept crying. Louder, harder, like the whole world had betrayed him. The child was wrapped in a blanket and pressed against the chest of a tall rancher sitting near the back of the coach. The man looked like someone used to controlling difficult situations. His shoulders were wide, his jaw tight, his clothes expensive despite the trail dust covering them. This was Owen Sutton. In Colorado and Wyoming territory, his name meant something. He owned thousands of acres of grazing land and employed more men than some small towns. But none of that power meant anything right now, because he could not make his son stop crying. Owen bounced the baby carefully, trying to calm him. His large hands moved awkwardly around the tiny body. "Easy now," he muttered under his breath. The baby screamed harder. Across from him, a railroad surveyor named Pruitt rubbed his temples. "Maybe the boy has colic," he said. Owen did not even look up. "He's been fed," Owen replied flatly. "Well, something's wrong with him. I'm aware." The baby let out another furious scream, as if agreeing with the statement. Owen felt his jaw tighten. 8 weeks. 8 weeks since his son had been born. 8 weeks since Owen's wife, Caroline, had died during childbirth. 8 weeks of sleepless nights, crying fits, and a helplessness Owen had never known before. He had built a ranch from nothing but stubborn will and hard work. He had negotiated land deals with men who carried guns and meant to use them. But none of that had prepared him for fatherhood, especially not alone. He had hired a wet nurse in town. For a while, that had worked. But yesterday she sent word that her own baby had fallen ill and she could not come anymore. The bottle had failed. Goat's milk had failed. Everything had failed. Which was why Owen Sutton, wealthy rancher and proud man, now sat in a rattling stagecoach headed toward Fort Collins with a screaming child and no idea what he was doing. The baby cried harder. Owen tried rocking him again. Still nothing. Across the coach sat a quiet woman in a simple gray dress. Her name was Vera Buckley. She had been staring out the window for most of the journey, watching the endless grasslands roll by. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, like someone who had learned to make herself small. But the sound of the crying baby was starting to affect her. Her fingers tightened slowly together, because her body recognized that cry, and her body remembered what it meant. 6 months earlier, Vera had buried her daughter. Martha had lived only 3 weeks. Too small, too fragile. Her lungs had never fully developed. Vera had held the tiny child while she faded away on a cold February morning. Frost had covered the windows like lace, and afterward, Vera had thought the worst was over. But grief had strange ways of lingering. Her body had continued producing milk long after the baby was gone. Painful reminders of what she had lost. The midwife had suggested tight cloth binding and bitter herbal teas. Slowly, the milk had lessened, but it had never fully stopped. Now, sitting only a few feet from a screaming infant, Vera felt something terrible and familiar happen. Her chest tightened. Warmth spread through her body. The instinct returned like a forgotten command. Feed the baby. Vera closed her eyes and tried to ignore it. This was not her child. This was not her life. Across from her, Owen Sutton looked down at his son with raw exhaustion. The baby's cries had changed now. They sounded weaker, more desperate. The cry of a child who had moved past anger and into panic. Vera's heart twisted painfully. She knew that cry. Every mother knew it. The baby was hungry. Really hungry. Owen tried the bottle again. The infant pushed it away and screamed. One of the passengers groaned loudly. "I'm riding up top with the driver," Pruitt announced. He climbed out of the coach through the front door without another word. No one stopped him. Inside the coach, the crying continued. Vera could feel the pressure in her chest growing. Her hands trembled slightly. She tried to keep looking out the window, tried to pretend none of this was happening. But the baby cried again, and something inside her finally broke. Vera stood up carefully as the stagecoach rocked along the trail. Owen looked up at her immediately, defensive and tired. Vera gripped the seat to steady herself. "He's hungry," she said quietly. Owen frowned. "He's been fed. Not the way he needs." The words hung in the dusty air of the coach. Owen stared at her. Understanding came slowly. Then shock. "You're a widow?" he asked. Vera nodded once. "I lost my daughter 6 months ago." She swallowed. "My body hasn't forgotten how to feed a baby." Silence filled the coach. Owen looked down at his screaming son, then at Vera. "You would do that?" he asked quietly. Vera met his eyes. "For him," she said. "Not for you." Owen hesitated only a moment. Then he pulled the small curtain across the back of the stagecoach to give them privacy. His hands trembled slightly as he handed the baby over. Vera took the child carefully into her arms. He was lighter than she remembered Martha being. The baby screamed once more. Vera adjusted him gently. "Shh," she whispered softly. And then she did the unthinkable. Behind the thin curtain of the stagecoach, the world suddenly became quiet. Not truly quiet, of course. The wheels still rattled over the rocky trail. The driver still shouted at the horses. Dust still drifted through the wooden frame of the coach. But for Vera Buckley, everything else disappeared. She loosened the buttons of her dress with steady fingers, even though her heart was pounding hard in her chest. This was madness. She barely knew the man sitting on the other side of the curtain. She did not know his life, his past, or the kind of man he truly was. But she knew the sound of a starving baby. And that was enough. The child screamed again, his tiny body shaking with anger and exhaustion. Vera guided him gently toward her breast. For a moment he resisted, confused by the change. Then instinct took over. The baby latched. The change was instant. The crying stopped so suddenly that it felt almost shocking. Instead of screams, the coach filled with the quiet rhythm of feeding. Small gulping sounds, soft breaths, the tiny movements of a baby finally getting what he needed. Vera gasped softly. The first pull was painful. Her body had almost forgotten this feeling. But then the pain faded into something else. Relief. Warmth. A strange sense of rightness that made tears suddenly spill down her face. The baby drank greedily, his small hands opening and closing against her skin as if he could not believe his luck. Vera cried silently while holding him. Her body remembered everything, the weight of a baby in her arms, the quiet connection between mother and child, the feeling of giving life through her own body. It had been 6 months since she had felt that. 6 months since Martha had died in her arms. Now this tiny stranger clung to her as if she had always belonged to him. "Easy now," she whispered softly. "There you go." The baby made a small, satisfied sound and kept feeding. Outside the curtain, Owen Sutton stood with his back pressed against the wall of the coach. His hands were braced on either side of him, as if he needed the support. He had heard the crying stop. He had heard the quiet feeding sounds, and he felt something heavy shift inside his chest. His son was alive because of that woman. A stranger, a widow who had stepped forward when he could do nothing. The middle-aged woman sitting nearby leaned toward him. "That's a good woman you've got there," she whispered. Owen opened his eyes slowly. "She's not mine," he said. The woman gave him a knowing look. "Give it time." 15 minutes later, the curtain moved. Vera stepped out quietly. Her dress was buttoned again, her expression calm, though her eyes were still slightly red. In her arms, the baby slept peacefully. His face had relaxed. The angry redness was gone from his cheeks. He looked like a completely different child. Owen stared at him in disbelief. "That's the first time he's been quiet all day," he said softly. Vera nodded. He was hungry. Owen reached out carefully and took his son back into his arms. For a moment, his fingers brushed Vera's hand. Their eyes met. "Thank you," Owen said. His voice was rough. Vera simply nodded and returned to her seat across from him. She turned her face toward the window again, watching the endless grasslands roll past. But something inside her had already changed. The rest of the journey passed quietly. The baby slept. The passengers relaxed. Even the driver seemed less angry with his horses. By the time the stagecoach finally rolled into Fort Collins at sunset, the sky was glowing orange behind the distant mountains. The coach stopped in a cloud of dust. Passengers climbed down gratefully. Owen stepped onto the boardwalk first, still holding his sleeping son. Vera followed a moment later, retrieving her small trunk from the luggage rack. She adjusted her bonnet and prepared to leave. This was the end of it. She had helped a stranger's child. Now their lives would go separate ways. But before she could walk away, Owen approached her. "Miss Buckley," he said. Vera turned. "Mr. Sutton." They were careful now. Formal again. Two strangers pretending the intimacy of the stagecoach had never happened. "My sister lives here," Owen said. "I'll stay with her tonight." Vera nodded politely. "That sounds sensible." Owen shifted the sleeping baby in his arms. "He'll need to eat again soon," he said quietly. "Yes," Vera replied. "He'll need to eat tomorrow too, and the day after that." Vera understood immediately. Her stomach tightened. "My wet nurse quit yesterday," Owen continued. "I gathered that." Owen looked directly at her. "I need help." The words were simple, honest. "I can pay you," he added quickly. Vera said nothing. $30 a month, Owen said. "Room and board, separate quarters. You would care for my son." $30. It was more money than Vera had ever earned in her life, but that was not the part that frightened her. "I am not a servant," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to be." "Then what are you asking?" Owen looked down at his sleeping son. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet desperation. "I'm asking you to keep my boy alive." The words hit Vera harder than she expected. Owen swallowed. "I've built ranches. I've handled land deals. I've survived droughts and winters and bad men with guns." He looked back at her. "But I can't do this alone." Vera stood silently while the evening wind moved through the dusty street. Behind Owen, the sun dipped lower behind the mountains. "Just 1 month," Owen said quietly, "until I can find another solution." Vera looked at the baby, then at Owen. Finally, she nodded once. 1 month, she said. Owen let out a slow breath. "Thank you." Neither of them knew it yet, but that single decision would change both their lives forever. The Sutton Ranch stood in a wide valley where the Poudre River curved through endless grassland. The land stretched so far that the mountains on the horizon looked like shadows against the sky. When Vera Buckley arrived the next morning, she understood immediately why Owen Sutton had built his life here. The ranch was enormous. A large stone house stood at the center, with a wide wooden porch that faced the open fields. Nearby were barns, stables, bunkhouses, and long wooden corrals where horses moved restlessly in the morning light. It was beautiful and intimidating. A ranch hand named Rex had driven Vera out from town in a wagon. He spoke very little during the journey, only pointing when they arrived. "Boss said you stay there," he said, nodding toward a small cabin about 50 yards from the main house. The cabin was simple but clean. Inside was a bed with a handmade quilt, a small table, a chair, and a stove for cooking. It was not fancy, but it felt safe. Vera placed her trunk beside the bed and slowly unpacked the few things she owned. 3 dresses, her sewing kit, a worn Bible, and a small wooden box she had carried everywhere since her daughter died. She opened the box carefully. Inside lay the tiny white gown she had sewn for Martha. Her fingers touched the fabric for a moment. Then she closed the box again and slid it beneath the bed. Some grief you carried with you, other grief you set down, even if only for a little while. After washing her face, Vera walked toward the main house. She found Owen in the kitchen trying to heat a bottle while holding the baby in one arm. The child was already starting to cry. "You're heating it too fast," Vera said from the doorway. Owen jumped slightly. "What?" "The milk. It will burn his mouth." She crossed the room calmly, took the bottle from his hand, and started again. Owen watched quietly as she tested the temperature on her wrist. "You've done this before," he said. "Yes." The baby began crying harder. Vera held out her arms. "May I?" Owen handed the child over without hesitation. Vera settled into a chair and tried the bottle first. The baby refused immediately, turning his head away with a frustrated cry. She sighed softly. "Well," she said gently, "we tried." A moment later, the kitchen filled with quiet feeding sounds as the baby nursed peacefully. Owen leaned against the counter, watching in silence. "What is his name?" Vera asked after a moment. Owen hesitated. "He doesn't have one." Vera looked up. "He's 8 weeks old." "I know." "We never decided," Owen said quietly. "My wife wanted James after her father. I wanted Thomas." He swallowed. "Then she died before we could finish the argument." The baby finished feeding and fell asleep against Vera's chest. She looked down at the tiny face resting peacefully. "He deserves a name," she said gently. Owen nodded slowly. "You choose," he said. Vera blinked in surprise. "Me?" "You're keeping him alive," Owen said simply. Vera thought for a moment. "Thomas James Sutton," she said softly. "That way you both win the argument." Owen nodded once. "Thomas," he repeated quietly. The name fit. Life at the ranch slowly developed a rhythm. Thomas woke every few hours crying loudly. Vera fed him, walked him, and sang softly when he could not sleep. Owen tried to help, though he often looked like a man attempting a job he had never trained for. One morning, Thomas spit milk across Owen's shirt. Vera laughed before she could stop herself. It was the first real laughter she had made in months. Owen looked down at the mess on his shirt. "I believe that was deliberate," he said. "He's forming opinions already," Vera replied. "He takes after his father." Weeks passed, then months. Vera began moving through the house like she belonged there. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and made small shirts for Thomas when the old ones grew too tight. Owen worked long days on the ranch, but he found reasons to stop by the house more often than necessary. Sometimes he checked on Thomas. Sometimes he watched Vera quietly while she worked. Something gentle and complicated began growing between them. Neither of them spoke about it. One evening, Vera received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope made her hands turn cold. It was from Jasper Goodwin. 12 years earlier, Jasper had promised to marry her. For years, she had waited while he wrote letters filled with excuses about work and obligations. Now, after more than a decade, he was finally coming to claim that promise. When Owen returned from Denver a week later, he found Vera sitting in the kitchen holding the letter. "He's coming here," she said quietly. "Who?" "The man I was supposed to marry." Owen's face hardened slightly. "And what do you want to do?" "I don't want him." "Then tell him no." Weeks later, Jasper arrived at the ranch in a polished suit that looked terribly out of place among cattle and dust. Vera met him in the yard with Thomas in her arms. "We had an understanding," Jasper said. "We had letters," Vera replied calmly, "and 12 years of excuses. I can provide for you. I'm not waiting anymore." She turned and walked back toward the house. Behind her, Owen stepped forward onto the porch. "I think the lady made herself clear," he said. Jasper left shortly afterward. That evening, Owen found Vera in the kitchen. "I'm staying," she said quietly. Owen stared at her. "Because I want to," she added. "Not because I have nowhere else to go." Owen stepped closer. "Then stay," he said softly. Years later, people in Fort Collins would still tell the story about the widow who nursed a stranger's baby on a dusty stagecoach, about the rancher who could not quiet his own child, and about the family that began with one desperate moment of kindness. Sometimes the smallest act changed everything. Sometimes the unthinkable thing saved everyone.